A king's words carved in stone changed the world forever. The invention of writing did more than record history. It created a new kind of power. For the first time, rules could be set not by memory or local custom, but by permanent public decree. This video will show you how the earliest legal codes were masterful tools of statecraft, designed to unify kingdoms and crown their rulers with unprecedented authority. How did chiseling laws onto a monument actually make a king stronger? And why would announcing fixed penalties for crimes solidify a throne? By the end, you will understand the hidden blueprint of power that still shapes our concept of law today. What does it truly mean for justice to be set in stone? Before the stone was carved, justice lived in the air. It resided in the memories of elders, in the stories told by the fireside, in the customs passed from parent to child. In any given village, the law was what everyone remembered it to be: a dispute over property, a conflict between families, a question of compensation for a loss. All were settled by local leaders, priests, or the gathered voices of the community itself. This system was intimate and deeply rooted in tradition, but it was also fragile. The law in one town could be entirely different just a day's walk away. What counted as a serious offense here might be a minor misunderstanding there. The rules depended entirely on who you asked and on how well they could recall the precedents set by their own ancestors. This created a landscape not of unified order, but of countless little islands of custom, each with its own shifting shores. For a ruler trying to govern a growing kingdom, this was a recipe for chaos. How could you collect taxes, raise an army, or command loyalty if the very idea of right and wrong changed at every river crossing? Even more troubling was the potential for manipulation. Without a fixed text to point to, a powerful local chieftain or a persuasive elder could reinterpret tradition to suit their own interests, tilting the scales of justice in ways that served them, not the community or the crown. The king's authority in these distant places was a distant whisper, easily drowned out by the loud, familiar voice of local precedent. This was the fractured world the earliest lawgivers inherited, a world where justice was personal, variable, and ultimately weak as a tool of central power. The stage was set not for an evolution, but for a revolution in stone. Then came the city. The village was a world of familiar faces, but the city was a sea of strangers. Imagine the scene at a bustling Mesopotamian river port, not centuries after writing was invented. A merchant from the northern highlands haggles with a trader from the southern marshes over a shipment of copper ingots. They speak different dialects, worship different gods, and carry with them the completely different customs of their distant homelands. A dispute arises. Who do they appeal to? The elder from the merchant's village is a month's journey away. The local priest only knows the traditions of his own city's patron deity. There is no shared memory, no common oral history to fall back upon. This was the new reality of urbanization and expanding trade networks. Populations were exploding, mixing people from diverse backgrounds into dense, anonymous urban centers. The old system of justice, built on personal relationships and localized tradition, shattered under this new scale. You could not rely on communal memory when the community itself was a crowd of 10,000 people who had never met. Economic life grew too complex, too fast. Contracts for future deliveries of grain, loans of silver with interest, partnerships in long-distance caravan ventures, all required a certainty that oral promises could not provide. In this impersonal environment, trust was the most valuable and fragile commodity. Disputes were no longer family matters. They were economic catastrophes waiting to happen, capable of stalling a city's entire marketplace. A king watching this chaos unfold saw a threat to his realm's prosperity and stability, but also a profound opportunity. The problem was a lack of a common script. The solution would be to literally provide one. To manage this new world of strangers, justice needed to become predictable, visible, and detached from the whims of any individual. It needed a standard that a foreign merchant, a local farmer, and a royal official could all point to and agree upon. The stage was no longer the village square, it was the kingdom itself, and it demanded a law written not in memory but in stone. Into this fractured world, a king made a declaration that would echo for millennia. On the sun-baked plains of Sumer, around 2,100 years before the Common Era, a ruler named Ur-Nammu did something unprecedented. He ordered his scribes to take a damp tablet of clay and, with a reed stylus, press into it a series of wedge-shaped marks. These cuneiform inscriptions did not record a battle or a tribute list. They recorded law. This collection, known today as the Code of Ur-Nammu, is the oldest surviving written legal code we have discovered. It is our first clear blueprint for the architecture of standardized justice. The code itself is a fascinating document. It begins not with a list of crimes but with a prologue. In it, Ur-Nammu establishes his divine mandate, stating that the gods themselves chose him to establish equity in the land, to banish disorder, and to protect the vulnerable from the powerful. This was a masterstroke of political narrative. By rooting his authority in the divine, the king positioned himself not as a mere administrator, but as the essential conduit for cosmic order. Then comes the structure that would become a template for centuries. The laws are written as conditional statements, simple if-then formulas. If a man commits a certain act, then this is the consequence. They address very human, everyday conflicts, things like assault causing injury, disputes over property boundaries, the responsibilities of slave owners, and compensation for damaged crops. For instance, one law states that if a man knocks out the eye of another man, he must pay a specific weight of silver. The amount is fixed, written down, and applicable to anyone. This was the revolutionary core. No longer would the penalty depend on the memory or bias of a local elder. The price for an eye was now a matter of public record, set by the king's decree and, by extension, the will of the gods. The physical form of this law is as important as its content. Inscribed on clay tablets, it was durable and could be copied. While we do not know how many public monuments displayed these laws, the very existence of the written text meant that the king's justice could, in theory, be known, referenced, and replicated across his realm. Ur-Nammu's code was a prototype, a first bold experiment in using the permanence of writing to cement a new idea, that justice itself could be a uniform, royal product. With this template set, the question became, how could this tool of power be refined and amplified to truly transform a kingdom? The idea proved too powerful to remain in one city. The concept of written law, pioneered by Ur-Nammu, did not fade with his dynasty. Instead, it traveled, adopted and refined by the kings who followed, each adding their own stamp to this new instrument of rule. Roughly a century and a half later, in the city-state of Isin, another ruler named Lipit-Ishtar commissioned his own legal monument. His code, discovered on fragmented clay tablets, shows us that the written law was evolving from a bold experiment into a sophisticated tool of statecraft. The Code of Lipit-Ishtar follows the same basic if-then structure, dealing with familiar matters of property, family, and personal injury. But the framing is different, more elaborate, more intentionally grand. Lipit-Ishtar's code is bookended by a lengthy prologue and a formal epilogue, creating a literary envelope for the laws themselves. In these sections, the king's voice is not just administrative, it is performative and deeply ideological. He proclaims that the great gods An and Enlil called him by name to establish justice in the land, to bring well-being to the people of Sumer and Akkad. He describes himself as a wise shepherd, a faithful farmer cultivating the seed of kingship. The epilogue then calls down blessings on those who obey the stele and curses upon any who would dare damage or alter his inscribed words. This is a crucial development. The law is no longer presented as merely a useful list of rules. It is now a sacred covenant, a direct gift from the gods through their chosen intermediary, the king. By wrapping the legal statutes in this rich narrative of divine selection and benevolent mission, Lipit-Ishtar was doing something profound. He was building the moral and spiritual legitimacy for his power directly into the legal document itself. To follow the law was to obey the gods and support the righteous king. To dispute it was to challenge the cosmic order. This code demonstrates that the template was solidifying. A royal legal proclamation had become an expected, almost essential part of Mesopotamian kingship. It was a ceremony of power performed in clay and stone, proving that justice, when written down, was about far more than settling disputes. It was about telling a story where the king was the hero and his authority was the happy ending. Yet, even this refined model was merely a precursor. The ultimate expression of this concept, the one that would cast the longest shadow across history, was still being carved in a darker, more formidable stone. But the ultimate expression of this concept was still waiting in a Babylonian quarry. Nearly 3 centuries after Lipit-Ishtar, a king named Hammurabi ascended the throne of a modest city-state on the Euphrates. Through decades of shrewd diplomacy and military campaigns, he forged an empire that stretched across Mesopotamia. His greatest legacy, however, was not won on the battlefield, but carved from a single, towering block of black diorite stone. The Code of Hammurabi, created around 1,750 years before the Common Era, represents the apex of the ancient legal form. It is a masterpiece of political communication designed to be seen, understood, and remembered. The monument itself is a powerful visual statement. At the top of the nearly 8-foot-tall stele, a detailed bas-relief shows Hammurabi standing before the enthroned sun god Shamash, the divine patron of justice. Shamash extends the rod and ring, symbols of royal authority and the measuring tools of a just ruler, directly to the king. This image is not a decoration, it is the thesis of the entire document. In one glance, every viewer understands the message. Justice flows from the gods to the king, and from the king to the people. Below this divine endorsement are inscribed 282 laws, covering every conceivable aspect of Babylonian life, from commercial contracts and property rights to family law, professional fees, and personal injury. The famous principle of Lex Talionis, an eye for an eye, appears here, but it is only one part of a vast, meticulous system. The comprehensiveness is the point. Hammurabi sought to provide a fixed answer for nearly every dispute, creating a sense of total coverage, of a system so complete it left no room for arbitrary judgment. This was justice as a royal product, standardized and packaged. But the true genius of the stele lies in its intended audience and its permanence. Historians believe copies were erected in temples and public squares across the empire. The diorite stone, incredibly hard and difficult to carve, was chosen for its durability, meant to last for eternity. The laws were therefore immutable. They could not be quietly changed or forgotten. For a traveling merchant, a local farmer, or a visiting dignitary, the message was unmistakable. Here, in this public space, was the unambiguous law of the land, authorized by the gods and enforced by the king's officials. It created a shared legal reality for millions of people who had never met. The code was less about enforcing every single statute in every village, and more about broadcasting an idea that Hammurabi was the sole source of order in a complex world. His justice was literally set in stone, a permanent, visible anchor for his power. With this monumental act, the written law had been perfected as a tool of consolidation. but a critical question remains: how did these fixed codes actually work in the messy reality of everyday life? Yet the stone itself was only half the story. To truly understand the power of these codes, you must read the words that frame the laws, the prologue and epilogue that bookend the statutes like a royal seal. In Hammurabi's code, this framing is not a simple introduction. It is a political manifesto, a king's resume carved in stone for the gods and all of humanity to see. Before listing a single law, Hammurabi spends column after column establishing who he is and why he alone has the right to pronounce these judgments. He names the great gods Anu and Enlil and declares they called him by name to promote the welfare of the people. He then launches into a breathtaking list of his achievements, city by city. He is the pious prince who provides abundant water for the people of Nippur. He is the wise protector who strengthened the walls of Isin. He is the benevolent shepherd who gathered the scattered people of Maljum and provided pastures for them. He lists over a dozen cities and regions, each with a specific benefit he bestowed. This is not a random brag. This is a calculated argument. By cataloging his tangible gifts to every corner of his realm, Hammurabi is building an unassailable case for his legitimacy. He is proving his divine mandate through action. The message is clear: because the gods chose me, I have brought you peace, water, prosperity, and protection. Therefore, the laws that follow are not my arbitrary whims. They are the logical extension of my divinely ordained benevolence. The prologue makes the king himself the indispensable hero of the story. It argues that social order and justice are not possible without him. He is the cause, and the written laws are the effect. The epilogue at the monument's end reinforces this with powerful finality. It calls on any future king to heed his just decrees and curses anyone who would dare erase his name or alter his judgments. He asks the gods to inflict famine, shattered cities, and the obliteration of their rule upon such a person. This transforms the legal code from a practical document into a sacred, eternal covenant. To disobey is not just to break a rule, it is to invite cosmic catastrophe. This framing was the masterstroke. The detailed laws in the middle provided the standardized system, but the prologue and epilogue sold the ideology. They answered the fundamental question of any government: why should you obey me? And they answered it with a blend of divine right, proven performance, and the threat of divine retribution. The law code's first and most important function was to legitimize the king, to make his power appear not as conquest, but as the natural, necessary foundation for a just world. But what did justice look like on the ground, in the gritty reality of a broken bone or a stolen ox? The answer lies in a principle so famous it has echoed for millennia, yet is almost universally misunderstood. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. This concept, known as Lex Talionis, stands at the very heart of Hammurabi's code and its revolutionary purpose. To our modern ears, it sounds like a brutal call for vengeance, but in its original context, it was something radically different, a deliberate and sophisticated tool for limiting violence. Before written law, a personal injury could spiral into a generational catastrophe. If a man from one family injured a man from another, the response was not measured by a royal standard. It was dictated by honor, by the thirst for retaliation, and by the relative power of the families involved. A broken arm might be avenged with a killing. That killing would demand another and another, plunging communities into cycles of bloodshed that could last for decades. Justice was personal, explosive, and utterly destabilizing. The King's Code aimed to cut this cycle off at its root by declaring that the penalty for knocking out a man's eye was precisely one eye. The law imposed a strict ceiling on retaliation. It said, the debt is paid here, no more. This was not an invitation to violence, it was a legal formula designed to end it. The state, through the written law, was inserting itself into the heart of the dispute, replacing the family's right to vengeance with a royal standard of proportionate justice. The goal was to depersonalize the conflict, to transform a raw emotional feud into a cold, administrative transaction. But the true genius of the system was in its breathtaking specificity and its acknowledgement of social reality. The code applied the principle of proportionality not just to the injury, but to the status of the individuals involved. The famous eye for an eye rule typically applied only when both parties were of the same social standing, free citizens of the Awalu class. If a nobleman broke the bone of another nobleman, his own bone would be broken. This was the law of equals. However, if that same nobleman injured a commoner or a slave, the penalty was almost always a financial fine, a payment of silver. The injury was still measured and compensated, but the form of compensation reflected the rigid social hierarchy. This was not equality as we understand it, but it was a brutal kind of predictability. Everyone from the highest noble to the lowest laborer could look at the stele and know in advance the exact cost of every action. For a minor injury to a fellow commoner, you might owe 10 shekels of silver. For striking a nobleman, the price soared to 60. This created a fixed tariff for harm, a price list for crime that applied across the entire kingdom. Imagine the power of that predictability. A dispute no longer had to escalate into a guessing game of honor and potential violence. The aggrieved party knew what they were owed. The perpetrator knew what they must pay. This system channeled the chaotic energy of personal vengeance into a controlled economic or corporal transaction, overseen and enforced by the king's officials. By standardizing punishment, the crown did not just settle arguments, it actively dismantled the private justice systems of families and clans, pulling the authority to judge and punish firmly into the hands of the state. The message was clear: the right to retaliate belongs to the king alone, and he has published his rates. The law's true revolution was in its meticulous accounting. Beyond the dramatic eye for an eye principle, the bulk of these ancient codes functioned as exhaustive, almost bureaucratic price lists for social harmony. Every conceivable disruption had its fixed cost meticulously recorded. A surgeon's fee for a successful operation was set at 10 shekels of silver, but if the patient was a nobleman and the surgery failed, the penalty was the surgeon's own hand. The cost for renting an ox was stipulated, and so was the fine if you negligently broke that ox's horn or tail. Even a barber who shaved off the slave hairlock of another man's slave without permission faced a specific financial penalty. This granular detail served a profound purpose. It removed ambiguity from daily life. In a dispute, there was no need for a lengthy debate about what was fair. One simply consulted the royal tariff. The injured party knew exactly what compensation to demand, and the perpetrator knew precisely what debt they owed. This system channeled the raw, volatile energy of conflict into a clean, predictable transaction. But here is the crucial shift: these fines were not paid to a local chieftain or a temple as a personal tribute. They were owed to the state or directly to the victim, as decreed by the king's written word. This directly undermined the power of local elites. Why would you seek justice from a village elder whose judgment might be swayed, when you could point to the king's own monument and demand the royal rate? The law stele became a bypass, routing authority and wealth away from traditional power centers and directly toward the central state and its designated citizens. This monetization of justice was a brilliant administrative tool, but it also revealed the law's other, darker function: to freeze the social order in stone. The codes did not create a uniform price for harm, they meticulously calibrated it by social rank. Babylonian society was divided into 3 clear tiers: the awalum, or free noble, the mushkenem, a commoner or dependent citizen, and the wardem, a slave. The law treated these categories with stark mathematical inequality. If a nobleman struck another nobleman, he faced a corporal penalty, an eye for an eye. But if that same nobleman struck a commoner, he merely paid a fine. The injury was compensated, but the form of compensation reinforced the hierarchy. The nobleman's body was sacred, the commoner's was worth silver. The disparity grew more severe further down the ladder. The penalty for accidentally killing a noblewoman's slave was a payment of 20 shekels of silver to her owner, treating the loss as property damage. However, if a slave struck a nobleman, the punishment was the slave's ear being cut off, a permanent, degrading mark of their station. This was not an oversight, it was the entire point. By writing these distinctions into the permanent law, the king was doing something extraordinary. He was taking the informal, often fluid social realities of his time and casting them into an official, rigid framework. The code declared, this is not just how things are, this is how they must be forever. It turned social custom into legal fact, making the hierarchy legible, enforceable, and backed by the full might of the crown. To obey the law was to accept your place within this ordained structure. The king's justice, therefore, was not blind. It saw status with perfect clarity, and its scales were weighted accordingly. Yet the law's gaze did not stop at the marketplace or the street. It followed a citizen home, crossing the threshold to regulate the most intimate foundation of society, the family. For the first time, matters of marriage, divorce, and inheritance were pulled from the realm of unwritten family tradition and brought under the clarifying and controlling light of written statute. This was perhaps the deepest penetration of royal authority, standardizing the private sphere itself. Take the marriage contract. In Babylon, a marriage was not merely a social or religious union. It was a legal and economic transaction formalized by a written contract. The code stipulated the bride price to be paid by the groom's family to the bride's father, and the dowry brought by the bride into the new household. These were not casual gifts, they were legally protected property. The dowry, in particular, remained the wife's possession. If the husband initiated a divorce without cause, he was obligated to return her dowry in full, and in some cases provide additional silver. This gave a wife a measure of economic security and leverage within the marriage, a right explicitly guaranteed by the king's law, not just her family's goodwill. But this legal protection came with equally legal constraints. The laws surrounding adultery were severe and asymmetrical. If a married woman was accused of infidelity, the burden of proof could be terrifyingly mystical, involving an ordeal by water. Her societal value was tied directly to her role as a faithful wife and mother. Conversely, a husband's extramarital relationships were not treated with the same legal severity, reflecting the patriarchal structure the code sought to uphold. The status of widows was also carefully defined. A widow had the right to remain in her husband's house and was entitled to support from his estate. She could even remarry if she chose. However, these rights were conditional on her conduct and were meticulously outlined in the law, preventing her late husband's clan from arbitrarily casting her out or seizing her property. Inheritance was another area meticulously codified. Sons generally inherited equal shares of their father's estate, ensuring the family's wealth and land holdings were formally divided according to a royal standard, not left to the potentially contentious decisions of local elders. In cases where there were no sons, daughters could inherit, preventing the dissolution of a family's assets. By writing these rules, the king accomplished something profound. He made the state a silent partner in every marriage, a guarantor in every inheritance, and an arbiter in every domestic dispute. Where once a family's internal matters were settled behind closed doors according to their own customs, now there was a higher authority to appeal to, and its judgments were carved on a public stele for all to see. This did not necessarily liberate the individual, but it systematically weakened the autonomous power of the extended family or clan. The ultimate loyalty was redirected from the kinship group to the king, whose laws provided the framework for family life itself. The household had become a unit of the state, its stability and order now a matter of royal concern and royal design. But the law's reach extended far beyond the family home, into the bustling heart of the city, the marketplace. Here, amid the clamor of traders and the clink of silver, the written codes performed perhaps their most vital economic function. They provided the first reliable operating system for a complex, impersonal economy. Think of a merchant from the distant north arriving at the gates of Babylon with a caravan of tin. He needs to warehouse his goods, sell them for silver, purchase a shipment of woven textiles, and arrange safe transport back home. Every step of this journey is fraught with risk. Without a common legal reference, every agreement is a leap of faith, dependent on the word of a stranger. The King's Code changed that calculus entirely. It supplied a ready-made framework of commercial law. It stipulated standard interest rates for loans of silver or grain, often around 20% for silver and 33% for grain. This was not arbitrary. It was a published rate that both lender and borrower could anticipate, preventing usurious exploitation and encouraging the flow of capital. The laws detailed the responsibilities in business partnerships. If two men entered into a joint venture and one contributed silver while the other did the traveling and trading, the code specified how profits were to be split. More importantly, it outlined the liabilities. If a trader was robbed on the road through no fault of his own, he could swear an oath to the gods and be absolved of the debt to his investor. But if he lost the goods through negligence or poor judgment, he was required to make full restitution. This created a clear distinction between misfortune and malpractice, allowing commerce to continue even in the face of inevitable risks. The codes also addressed the mundane but critical details of hired property. If you rented a boat from a boatman and accidentally sank it, you owed him a new boat. The cost of renting a farm animal for a day was fixed, and so was the penalty if that animal was injured while in your care. This meticulous attention to liability transformed economic interactions. It reduced what economists call transaction costs, the time, energy, and uncertainty spent simply figuring out if you can trust someone to keep a deal. By providing predictable rules for failure, the law actually encouraged more ambitious ventures. A merchant could calculate risk with remarkable precision. He knew the exact financial consequence of a sunken boat or a lost caravan, which meant he could plan for it, insure against it, or decide the potential profit was worth the legally defined penalty. This reliability was a powerful magnet. It attracted foreign merchants who brought new goods, ideas, and wealth into the kingdom. It enabled local markets to grow in scale and sophistication, moving beyond simple barter to complex systems of credit, futures contracts, and long-distance trade. And all of this flourishing activity generated one thing above all: revenue for the crown. Taxes on trade, tariffs on goods, and fees from legal disputes all flowed into the royal coffers, funding the army, the bureaucracy, and the monumental building projects that proclaimed the king's glory. The state, by guaranteeing the rules of the game, became the essential referee and primary beneficiary of the economic boom it created. The law, in standardizing commerce, had not just settled disputes, it had built the financial engine of the empire itself. The black diorite stele stood in the temple plaza, a silent sentinel of order. For the vast majority of Babylonians who passed it, the intricate cuneiform script spiraling down its surface was an unreadable mystery. Literacy was the domain of a tiny elite, the scribes and priests and officials. So why place this complex legal text in the most public space imaginable? The answer reveals a masterclass in political theater. The monument's power did not come from its readability, but from its sheer, imposing presence. Erected in sacred or civic centers, the stele was a permanent, physical anchor for the king's promise. Its location was a message in itself. By placing it beside the temple, Hammurabi fused his law with divine authority. suggesting his justice flowed from the same source as the god's favor. In the city square, it proclaimed that royal order was the foundation of public life. Every citizen, whether noble, merchant, or farmer, saw the same stone. They may not have understood the words, but they understood the symbol. They saw the carved image of the king receiving authority from the sun god. They witnessed scribes or officials perhaps referencing it. They heard elders discuss the king's judgments. This created a potent illusion, the idea that justice was now transparent, fixed, and accessible to all. The law was no longer a secret whispered in an elder's chamber. It was out in the open for everyone to see, even if they could not read it. This was the genius of the public display. It transformed the legal code from a practical document into a monumental piece of propaganda. Its primary function was to broadcast an ideal, the image of Hammurabi as the fount of all justice. The stele told a story of a benevolent, all-seeing ruler who had standardized fairness and banished the chaos of arbitrary judgment. Whether the laws were consistently enforced in every remote village was almost secondary. The perception was everything. The monument manufactured consent by creating a shared reality. A farmer wronged in a land dispute could now point to that stele and say, "The king has a law for this." He may never get a royal judge to hear his case, but he believes the system exists, and that belief channels his hope and his loyalty toward the central authority, not toward local strongmen. The code's immutability was another key part of the performance. Carved in the hardest stone, it presented the law as eternal and unchanging. This conveyed stability in a world that was anything but. It told the people that the rules of the game would not shift with the seasons or the whims of a new local governor. The king's word was literally set in stone, a promise meant to outlive him. This propaganda of permanence was a powerful tool for consolidation. It assured merchants that their contracts were secure. It assured families that their inheritances were protected. And it assured every subject that the social hierarchy was now a permanent feature of the cosmos, endorsed by the gods and carved by the king. In the end, the true power of Hammurabi's stele lay less in its detailed statutes and more in the profound idea it planted in the mind of the empire, that justice was a public, royal commodity, and that the king was its sole and righteous distributor. Yet this monumental promise faced a silent, practical obstacle. The vast majority of people in ancient Mesopotamia could not read. In a world where literacy was a rare and powerful skill, confined to a small class of scribes, priests, and high officials, the beautifully carved laws were, for most citizens, an elegant mystery. They could see the imposing stone and the intricate symbols, but the specific words were a locked door. So how did this system of standardized justice actually function in the muddy streets and crowded market stalls? The answer lies not in public literacy, but in professional administration. These codes were less like today's public statutes and more like authoritative reference manuals for a specialized guild. Their most immediate practical purpose was to train and guide the kingdom's legal and administrative class. A young scribe learning his craft would not only copy lists of commodities or royal annals, he would meticulously copy sections of the legal code. This was a core part of his education. By writing out the if-then formulas for property disputes, personal injury, and commercial contracts, he was internalizing the royal standard. He was memorizing the official tariff for every conceivable conflict. When he later took up a post as a court scribe or a local administrator, this standardized knowledge went with him. He became a living repository of the king's justice, capable of recalling the correct ruling because he had written it himself 100 times. Judges and magistrates, often drawn from this same literate elite, would rely on these trained scribes and on their own consultation of the written law to guide their decisions. The public stele, then, served as the ultimate source text, the master copy from which all other copies and all official understanding flowed. Its public placement was a symbol of its authority, but its daily application was mediated through the scribal bureaucracy. This system ensured a remarkable consistency. A dispute over an irrigation ditch in a northern province would, in theory, be judged according to the same principles as a similar case in a southern city, because the officials in both places were trained from the same canonical text. The code created a common legal language for the empire's administrators, even if the common person did not speak it. For the average farmer or merchant, the law became real through its interpreters. You might not be able to read the stele, but you knew there was a royal judge in the district capital who could. You knew that judge operated by a fixed set of rules that came from the king himself, not from local favoritism. This perception was transformative. It meant that even in a largely illiterate society, the idea of a centralized, predictable justice could take root. The monument's grandeur convinced people the system existed, and the trained scribes made it operate. The written code, therefore, consolidated power in a very concrete way by creating a unified administrative core whose expertise and authority derived solely from the king's inscribed word. But this monumental shift was not merely about fairness. The standardization of justice was, in its very design, an act of supreme political centralization. Every law inscribed on those stones served a dual purpose: to settle disputes and to systematically dismantle rival sources of power. For millennia, the authority to judge had been dispersed, held by village elders who remembered local customs, by temple priests who interpreted divine will, and by tribal chieftains who enforced the rules of kingship. These figures were the pillars of community life, but to an ambitious king they were obstacles. Their power was personal, localized, and unpredictable. The written code offered a brilliant solution, a single, immutable reference point that overruled them all. Suddenly, the elder's memory of tradition was no longer the final word. If a dispute arose, one could now bypass him entirely and appeal to the king's published decree. The priest's pronouncement on a matter of property or oath could be checked against the royal statute. The code did not just provide an alternative, it presented itself as the superior, more legitimate authority. It argued that the king's justice, being written and standardized, was more transparent and consistent than the variable judgments of local figures. This was a quiet revolution in everyday governance. By offering a predictable outcome, the law actively encouraged people to bring their grievances to royal officials, to judges appointed by the crown, rather than to traditional community leaders. This redirected the flow of social authority, like diverting a river into a single, state-controlled canal. The king's judges, often scribes trained on the very text of the code, became the new arbiters. Their power derived not from age, lineage, or religious standing, but from their mastery of the royal document. In this new system, all legal authority now flowed from, and was interpreted through, the king's written word. He was no longer just a powerful figure among many. He became the ultimate source of law itself. To obey the code was to obey the king. To seek justice was to seek his intervention. The stone monuments, therefore, were not just lists of rules. They were the architectural blueprints for a new kind of state, one where the crown stood at the very center of the social universe, with every legal pathway leading directly back to the throne. This blueprint for power proved too effective to remain in one river valley. Far to the north and west, in the rugged highlands of Anatolia, another rising empire was reaching for the same tool. The Hittites, masters of iron and formidable chariot warriors, were also meticulous bureaucrats. From their capital at Hattusa, they produced a legal collection that echoes the Mesopotamian model, while revealing its remarkable adaptability to a different culture. The Hittite laws, compiled over centuries beginning around 1650 before the Common Era, are written in the same familiar, practical language of conditionals. If a man does this, then that shall be the penalty. The structure is a clear sibling to the codes of Hammurabi and Lipit-Ishtar, showing that the written legal form had become a recognized instrument of statecraft across the ancient Near East. But within that shared framework, the Hittite approach reveals a distinct philosophy, one often focused more on compensation than on corporal mirroring. Where Babylonian law might demand a limb for a limb in cases among equals, the Hittite statutes frequently convert that penalty into a payment. If a man blinds another, he is to pay 40 shekels of silver. If he knocks out a tooth, the fine is 12 shekels. This shift from retaliation to restitution suggests a different priority, keeping the labor force intact and resolving conflict through economic transfer rather than mutilating a productive citizen. The laws also provide fascinating windows into Hittite daily life and social values, with detailed rulings on the price of everything from a plow ox to a skilled artisan. One statute addresses the accidental death of a merchant in another land, outlining a complex procedure for local authorities to divide his possessions, a clear effort to protect long-distance trade. Others deal with the unique institution of sacred temple servants or the consequences of letting livestock stray into a neighbor's vineyard. These were the concerns of a society deeply connected to the land, engaged in far-flung commerce, and governed by a royal administration intent on predictability. The existence of the Hittite code, parallel yet distinct, underscores a crucial point. The written law was not a Mesopotamian patent, but a political technology. Any ambitious kingdom facing the same core challenges of integrating diverse peoples, managing complex economies, and centralizing authority could adopt and adapt this tool. The Hittite king, like his Babylonian counterpart, used these inscribed rules to broadcast his role as the guarantor of order, to standardize life across his realm, and to pull the threads of justice toward his own throne. The concept was transferable because the problem was universal: how to make a kingdom out of many tribes, and how to make a king the undisputed source of its order. Yet this monarchical model was not the only path to written law. To understand its unique power, we must glance at two other great traditions that emerged from very different soil. Far to the west of Mesopotamia, in the rocky highlands and coastal cities of the Mediterranean, writing was put to a profoundly different purpose. Consider the law given to the Israelites, recorded in the books of the Torah. Here, the lawgiver is not a king, but a prophet, Moses, acting as an intermediary. The laws themselves are presented not as royal decrees, but as divine commandments, revealed by a single God to an entire people. This was law embedded within a sacred covenant, a binding agreement between the divine and a community defined by faith and shared ancestry. The focus was on holiness, ritual purity, and social justice within that covenanted group. The authority did not flow from a palace to subjects, but from the summit of a sacred mountain to a nation. This created a legal tradition where legitimacy came from prophetic revelation and collective identity, not from a crown's ambition to consolidate earthly power. A different divergence appeared in the city-states of ancient Greece, when figures like Draco and later Solon in Athens inscribed laws on wooden beams or stone for public view. They were not acting as kings. They were often appointed reformers in a fiercely civic and increasingly republican context. The crisis they addressed was not how to unify an empire, but how to resolve violent class strife within a single, self-governing city. Solon's laws, for instance, famously sought to bridge the gap between wealthy aristocrats and indebted commoners. He wrote laws to cancel debts, forbid the enslavement of citizens for debt, and restructure political participation. His authority was temporary, granted by the citizen body to fix their broken system, and his goal was stability through a new civic balance, not the aggrandizement of a single ruler's personal power. The law here was a tool for civic repair and the foundation of a shared political space, the polis. These contrasts throw the Mesopotamian and Hittite model into sharp, revealing relief. Their codes were instruments of vertical consolidation, designed to pull authority upward to a single human sovereign. The king was both the author and the ultimate beneficiary, the sun around which all justice orbited. The Mosaic and early Greek traditions, while equally committed to written standards, emerged from horizontal relationships, covenant community, or civic citizenship. They distributed authority differently. This distinction is crucial. It shows that the act of writing law down was a powerful technology, but its purpose was shaped entirely by the political imagination of the culture that wielded it. In the river valleys of the Near East, that imagination was monarchical, absolute, and saw in permanent public text the perfect anchor for a throne. The stone stele was not just a legal document, it was the crown itself carved in diorite. But the stone's authority was not total. For all their monumental ambition, these legal codes were not ancient constitutions designed to govern every waking moment. They were surgical instruments, not a blanket. The vast, quiet landscape of daily life remained under the rule of unwritten custom. Think of the rhythm of an ordinary day in Babylon. The way a mother taught her daughter to grind grain, the songs sung during the harvest, the specific gestures of respect shown to a village elder, the intricate rituals of a local festival honoring a town's patron deity. None of this was dictated by Hammurabi's stele. The code did not prescribe how to cook a meal, how to court a spouse, or how to mourn a loss. These patterns were woven into the fabric of community life, passed down through generations by imitation and oral tradition. They were the invisible software that ran the society, and the king had little interest in rewriting it. Instead, the written law targeted very specific, high-stakes areas where custom had failed or where the state's core interests were directly threatened. The codes zeroed in on flashpoints, the kinds of conflicts that could unravel the social and economic order the king was trying to build. Violent conflict between individuals or families was a primary target because private vengeance was a direct challenge to the state's monopoly on force. Property disputes over land, water rights, or inheritance threatened agricultural production and social stability, the foundations of the kingdom's wealth. Commercial law regulated the marketplace, ensuring the flow of goods and taxes that fueled the royal treasury. And by legislating marriage, divorce, and the status of women and children, the state secured the basic unit of production and population growth, the family. The law intervened precisely where disorder would cost the crown the most. It set boundaries around the chaos it could not afford. This reveals the true, pragmatic genius of these early codes. They were not about creating a perfectly regulated society from the top down. They were about managing risk. The king's scribes were not writing a manual for living. They were drafting a crisis handbook. They identified the fractures most likely to break the kingdom apart and poured the cement of written law into those cracks alone. The rest, the immense territory of routine, ritual, and local identity, was left to the ancient, self-regulating power of custom. The state's power grew not by replacing tradition everywhere, but by strategically overriding it where it mattered most to the throne. The monumental law, however, was powerless without a human hand to wield it. A stele could proclaim justice, but it could not arrest a thief or collect a fine. The true consolidation of power happened not in the carving of the stone, but in the creation of a system to make its words a living reality. This required a new kind of official, the royal judge. These were not the elders of old, ruling by local memory. They were agents of the crown, often literate scribes who had been trained on the very text of the code. Their authority came from their mastery of the royal document, and their primary loyalty was to the king who appointed them. In major cities, these judges presided over courts, hearing cases brought before them. They would listen to testimony, examine evidence like contracts or seals, and then render a verdict based on the published statutes. Their decisions were recorded on clay tablets, creating a written record of justice administered in the king's name. This was the mechanism that transformed the monument's promise into daily practice, but the king's reach could not extend to every village. In more remote areas, local assemblies of leading citizens still gathered to settle disputes. Yet even here, the code's influence was profound. These assemblies now operated within the shadow of the royal law. They were expected to align their judgments with its principles, knowing that a dissatisfied party could potentially appeal to a royal judge. The written code provided a higher standard, a reference point that slowly reshaped local customs from the outside in. This two-tiered system, combining centralized royal courts with supervised local assemblies, allowed the king's justice to permeate society at multiple levels, ensuring the code was not just a symbol but a functional tool. Yet judges and assemblies faced a timeless challenge. How do you discover the truth when facts are contested and witnesses disagree? The codes provided an answer steeped in the worldview of the time, the ritual ordeal. In cases where evidence was lacking, particularly those involving serious accusations like adultery or sorcery, the law might prescribe a trial by water or river. The accused would be subjected to a physical test, such as being thrown into a sacred river. Survival was interpreted as divine vindication, a sign the gods had judged the person innocent. Failure to survive confirmed guilt. To modern eyes, this seems like superstition, but in its context, it was a sophisticated procedural tool. It offered a definitive, culturally accepted method to resolve otherwise intractable cases, preventing feuds from festering. More importantly, it placed the final judgment in the hands of the gods, whose authority was unquestioned. By incorporating the ordeal into the legal process, the state co-opted the ultimate source of legitimacy, framing its entire judicial system as an extension of divine will. The most common tool for ascertaining truth, however, was the sworn oath. Parties and witnesses would swear by the king's gods to tell the truth. To break such an oath was not merely to lie in court, it was to invite divine retribution, a risk considered far greater than any earthly penalty. This reliance on oaths and ordeals reveals a critical insight. The enforcement of the law depended as much on shared belief as on police force. The system worked because people believed in the power of the oath and the judgment of the river. The king's genius was in building his legal architecture upon these existing pillars of faith. Yet belief alone was not enough. Ultimately, the code's force rested on the state's growing capacity for coercion. Fines had to be collected, compensatory payments had to be enforced. In extreme cases, corporal punishments had to be carried out. This required a backbone of administrative muscle, tax collectors, bailiffs, and guards, all answerable to the royal court. The ability to back a verdict with tangible consequence, to make a losing party actually hand over 30 shekels of silver or submit to a prescribed penalty, was what separated the law from mere suggestion. This administrative and coercive apparatus was the final, crucial piece of the puzzle. It moved justice from a magnificent monument into a working mechanism of the state. The written code provided the script, the judges were the actors, and the royal administration was the stage crew that made the performance believable. Without this capacity for enforcement, the laws would have been empty words, a grand facade. With it, the king did not just announce justice, he delivered it, making his authority a daily, tangible fact in the lives of his subjects. The law's power was not only in its enforcement, but in its very presence. That towering black stele, standing silent in the public square, cast a long psychological shadow across the entire kingdom. Its permanence was a constant, quiet reminder. Every citizen, from the wealthiest merchant to the humblest farmer, understood that a fixed set of rules now governed the consequences of their actions. This knowledge, more than any royal guard, became the primary engine of order. The code functioned as a masterful deterrent, not through terror but through predictability. Before acting in anger or seizing an opportunity for deceit, a person could calculate the cost. They knew that injuring a neighbor carried a penalty of 60 shekels of silver, a sum that could ruin a family. They knew that tampering with a boundary stone meant a harsh and specific punishment. This certainty changed behavior at its root, encouraging people to resolve conflicts through the law's prescribed channels, or better yet, to avoid the conflict altogether. The state did not need to be everywhere at once because the idea of the state, embodied in that stone, was already in everyone's mind, but the steel's purpose ran even deeper than simple deterrence. It was a relentless propaganda machine for a single, powerful ideology, the ideology of stability. In a world historically rocked by invasions, droughts, and the shifting fortunes of rival city-states, the promise of unwavering order was incredibly seductive. The code presented the king's justice as immovable, as permanent as the diorite it was carved upon. It argued that chaos was the natural state, and that only through the king's divinely inspired laws could harmony be achieved and maintained. This narrative encouraged subjects to internalize the royal framework as the only sensible way for society to function. To obey was not just to avoid punishment, it was to participate in upholding the cosmic balance the king claimed to represent. Over time, this fostered a profound cultural shift. Compliance became less about fear of a specific penalty and more about accepting the system itself as the natural, correct order of things. People began to police themselves and their communities according to the royal standard, seeing local customs that contradicted the code as backward or unjust. This internalization was the crown's ultimate victory. It reduced the need for constant, costly direct intervention by the state's limited bureaucracy. Why post a soldier on every corner when every citizen had, in a sense, absorbed the soldier's duty? The law stele taught people to want the order it promised, to see their own safety and prosperity as inextricably linked to the king's vision. In this way, the written code did more than rule a kingdom. It shaped a collective consciousness, turning subjects into believers in the very system that consolidated power far above them. For centuries, the voices of these ancient lawgivers fell silent, their monumental stones buried under the dust of fallen empires. Their codes, so central to the exercise of power, became ghost stories, mere echoes in later traditions. The rediscovery of these texts is a modern detective story, one that rewrote our understanding of civilization's dawn. It began not with a grand expedition, but with curious markings on broken bits of clay and stone. In the early 19th century, European travelers and diplomats in the Middle East began sending back artifacts covered in strange, wedge-shaped symbols. Locals had long been finding these inscribed tablets and cylinders, sometimes using them as building materials or curiosities. No one could read them. The script, which we now call cuneiform, was a forgotten language, a locked door to the past. The breakthrough came through raw, relentless scholarly effort, a feat of intellectual decipherment that rivals the cracking of any code. Philologists comparing inscriptions from different sites slowly began to identify patterns. They worked from known languages to unknown, using trilingual inscriptions much like the Rosetta Stone for Egyptian hieroglyphs. A pivotal moment came with the translation of a massive inscription on a cliff face at Behistun in Persia, which proclaimed the deeds of King Darius in three scripts: Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian. This became the key. By the mid-19th century, the cuneiform script was yielding its secrets, and with it, the long-lost voices of Mesopotamia began to speak again. Then came the monumental finds. In 1901, a French archaeological team working at the ancient Elamite capital of Susa made a stunning discovery. They unearthed a massive, polished black diorite stone nearly 8 feet tall. It was the stele of Hammurabi, stolen as war booty by an Elamite king over 3,000 years earlier and taken to Susa. There it had lain, largely intact, a complete copy of the Babylonian king's famous code, complete with the iconic image of Hammurabi before the sun god Shamash. This was not a fragment, it was the entire legal manifesto waiting to be read. Around the same time, excavations at Nineveh, the Assyrian capital, revealed another treasure trove, the library of King Ashurbanipal. This was not merely a collection of scrolls, it was a systematic royal archive. Archaeologists found tens of thousands of clay tablets, meticulously organized, covering every aspect of knowledge, from astronomy and medicine to literature and, crucially, law. Among these tablets were copies of much older legal texts, including versions of the Code of Hammurabi and precedents like the Laws of Eshnunna. These libraries were time capsules, preserving the legal and administrative mind of an empire. The work of historians and philologists then shifted from decipherment to contextualization. Translating the words was only the first step. Understanding what they meant required piecing together the full picture of Mesopotamian society from other tablets, letters, economic records, and even private legal contracts. By comparing the grand proclamations on the steles with the mundane records of everyday court cases and contracts found elsewhere, scholars could see how the law actually functioned. They could trace the gap between royal ideal and local practice, understanding the code not as a static rulebook but as a living instrument of power and persuasion. This material evidence, the very stones and clay tablets, grounds our entire discussion. We are not dealing with philosophical speculation or later historical accounts. We are reading the original documents, the exact words a king ordered carved to standardize his realm and crown his authority. Every insight about centralization, every analysis of social hierarchy, flows from these physical objects, unearthed and understood, allowing us to witness the blueprint of power being drawn in real time, thousands of years ago. The laws spoke in volumes, but their most telling feature was a profound silence. They dictated the price of an eye, the fine for a stolen ox, and the rules for a marriage contract, yet they remained utterly mute on one critical subject, the power of the king himself. Read the prologue of Hammurabi's code, and you will find a ruler who proclaims himself the shepherd, the farmer of justice, the divinely appointed guardian of the weak. But search for a single law that limits his authority, that subjects his own decrees to a higher standard, or that allows a citizen to challenge his judgment in a royal court, and you will find nothing. This omission is not an accident or an oversight, it is the entire point. The code was designed to project the image of a just king, not to create a system where justice could be applied to him. In this careful silence, we hear the true voice of consolidated power. The law's purpose was to regulate society beneath the throne, to create order among the subjects, thereby freeing the king to operate above it. He was the source of the law, its divine sponsor, and its ultimate enforcer, a position that placed him conceptually outside its jurisdiction. Think of it as the architectural blueprint for a pyramid. The code meticulously laid out every brick, every relationship between the layers of society, defining how each tier interacted with the ones below it. But the capstone at the very top, the king, was not just another brick. It was the element that completed the structure, that held the entire form together, and it was governed by different, unwritten rules. This silence sent a clear message: the king's authority was not a product of the law. The law was a product of his authority. His power came from the gods, and the written code was simply his benevolent method for distributing that divine gift to the people. To question the king was not to cite a legal statute, it was to challenge the cosmic order itself. So while the code standardized justice for everyone else, it left royal power uniquely unstandardized, flexible, and absolute. This was the genius of the framing. It used the transparency of written rules to legitimize the ultimate opacity of supreme authority. The king could present himself as the servant of justice while remaining its unchallenged master. The law's logic becomes clearest in the gritty details of a single case. Consider Statute 229 from Hammurabi's Code. It states, if a builder constructs a house for a man, but does not make his work strong, and the house he built collapses and causes the death of the householder, that builder shall be put to death. This is not a vague principle, it is a precise, terrifyingly specific rule. Let us reconstruct how this law might have functioned in the streets of ancient Babylon. A wealthy merchant, let us call him Adad Nasir, commissions a builder, Ur-Nammu, to construct a new home for his family. They agree on a price, perhaps even sign a simple contract witnessed by a scribe. Ur-Nammu sources the materials, hires laborers, and oversees the construction. The house is completed, the merchant pays the final installment, and his family moves in. Then, during a seasonal rainstorm, a critical wall gives way. The roof collapses. Adad Nasir's wife is tragically killed in the rubble. In the old system before the code, what would happen next? Grief and rage would take over. The merchant's extended family might seek immediate vengeance against the builder, perhaps attacking him or his family. The builder's clan would retaliate. A cycle of violence could erupt, destabilizing the entire neighborhood and requiring the intervention of local elders who would have no clear standard to apply. Under Hammurabi's code, however, the procedure is radically different. The chaos of personal vengeance is immediately short-circuited. There is now a published royal rule for this exact catastrophe. The merchant, in his grief, does not gather his kinsmen for a raid. He goes, or is expected to go, to the local authorities, to a royal judge or a city assembly operating under the code's shadow. He presents his case. The judge would then investigate. Did the builder, Ur-Nammu, truly fail to make his work strong? Was the collapse due to shoddy materials, poor brickwork, or a flawed design? Or was it an act of the gods, a storm of unprecedented force? Witnesses might be called, other builders consulted to examine the rubble. The law creates a framework for a factual inquiry, shifting the focus from raw emotion to demonstrable cause. If the investigation finds the builder negligent, the penalty is absolute and severe, death. This outcome is harsh to modern sensibilities, but its logic within the system is impeccable. First, it establishes an extreme deterrent for professional malpractice. A builder knows that his literal life is on the line with every project. This incentivizes meticulous, high-quality work, protecting public safety in a dense urban environment where one collapsing house could endanger many. Second, and more crucially for state power, it resolves the crisis with finality. The penalty is not left to the grieving family to determine or execute. It is prescribed by the king and carried out by the state. The merchant receives a form of justice, but it is a public, royal justice that ends the matter. He cannot lawfully seek further vengeance, for the king's law has spoken. This transfers the right to punish from the private citizen to the crown. The social implication is profound. The code treats the builder's negligence not as a private wrong against one family, but as a crime against the communal order the king guarantees. A poorly built house is a threat to the city's stability, to the trust necessary for complex urban life. By intervening so decisively, the king positions himself as the guardian of that fundamental trust. The law also subtly reinforces social hierarchy. Notice the statute specifies the death of the householder, implying the victim is a property-owning head of a family, a man of some means. The code is most ferocious in protecting the interests and lives of the propertied class, the economic backbone of the kingdom. The brutal clarity of this law, from investigation to prescribed penalty, demonstrates how the written code worked as a social circuit breaker. It channeled catastrophic personal loss into a controlled, administrative process, delivering a standardized outcome that reinforced the king's role as the sole, authoritative source of order and ultimate justice. The law's meticulous price list did more than prevent blood feuds. It filled the royal treasury. every standardized fine, every compensation payment decreed by the stele, represented a deliberate financial design. While some payments went directly to victims as restitution, the state's hand was never far from the transaction. Court fees, penalties for swearing false oaths, and taxes on the silver changing hands in these legal settlements all fed a growing stream of revenue that flowed directly to the crown. This system transformed justice from a moral ideal into a measurable economic asset. Think of it as the kingdom's first reliable budgeting tool. Before written law, a king's wealth depended heavily on the unpredictable spoils of war or the fluctuating yields of royal land. The legal code introduced a new kind of income, one that was domestic, repeatable, and scaled with the population itself. The more disputes the courts settled according to the published tariffs, the more silver moved through channels the state could monitor and tax. This created a virtuous cycle for the throne. Stability bred economic activity, which generated legal disputes which were resolved by the king's courts, producing fines and fees that funded further stability. The revenue was then strategically deployed to build the visible pillars of royal power. The silver collected from a builder's negligence fine or a merchant's breach of contract could pay the stonemasons expanding the palace walls. Taxes on commercial disputes funded the granaries that fed the standing army, the very army that deterred invaders and ensured the law's reach across the realm. Most visibly, this wealth erected the monumental temples that housed the law steles themselves, physically linking the fiscal system to the divine authority that legitimized it. Even the bureaucracy that ran this entire machine was paid for by it. The scribes who recorded the judgments, the judges who presided over the courts, the tax collectors who ensured payments were made, all were salaried officials. Their livelihoods depended on the continuous, smooth operation of the legal code they administered. This created a self-perpetuating class with a vested interest in upholding the system. Their professional existence was proof of the law's success. In this light, the code reveals its second, equally vital function. It was the operational manual for a state funded not merely by conquest, but by its own internal order. The king was not just a lawgiver, he was the chief executive of a vast peacetime enterprise. By publishing The Cost of Disorder, he monetized justice itself, turning social harmony into a sustainable financial engine that powered everything from the chariots on his borders to the scribes in his archives. The grandeur of the palace and the might of the army were not just symbols of power, they were the direct products of 1,000 settled arguments, each priced according to the royal stone. The blueprint did not crumble with the empires that first drew it. The concept of a comprehensive, written code as a tool for unity proved so powerful that it refused to stay buried. Centuries after the last Babylonian scribe put down his stylus, the idea resurfaced, adapted by new powers with the same centralizing ambition. In the Roman Republic, around 450 years before the Common Era, a political crisis born of class conflict led to a pivotal moment. The plebeians, the common citizens, demanded protection from the arbitrary judgments of the patrician elite. The response was not a king's decree, but a commission that resulted in the law of the 12 tables. Inscribed on bronze and displayed publicly in the Roman Forum, these laws codified everything from court procedure and debt to family rights and property. While created for a republic, not a monarchy, the purpose echoed the ancient model: to suppress the variability of unwritten custom and establish a single, known standard applicable to all Roman citizens. It was a foundational step in creating a unified Roman legal identity, a crucial tool for governing a state that would soon sprawl across continents. The thread reappeared stronger than ever with the rise of imperial Rome. As the empire expanded, swallowing up dozens of distinct cultures with their own legal traditions, a chaotic patchwork of laws threatened administrative cohesion. Emperors and jurists responded with a relentless project of legal synthesis and codification. The most famous of these efforts culminated under the Emperor Justinian in the 6th century. His Corpus Juris Civilis, the body of civil law, was a monumental compilation and rationalization of centuries of Roman legal scholarship and imperial decrees. It was designed to be authoritative, comprehensive, and above all, uniform. This code served as the ultimate instrument for imperial unity, an attempt to govern diverse peoples from Spain to Syria by a single, coherent legal logic emanating from the center. When the Western Roman Empire fragmented, Justinian's code became a ghost in the machine, a dormant blueprint that would be rediscovered centuries later and ignite the legal imagination of medieval Europe. That rediscovery set the stage for the most direct modern heir to the ancient model. In the wake of the French Revolution, France was a nation of profound legal disunity. The country was a quilt of hundreds of local customary law jurisdictions, where, much like in ancient Mesopotamia, the law changed depending on where you stood. Napoleon Bonaparte, seizing the moment, saw in this chaos the same opportunity Ur-Nammu and Hammurabi had seen. He commissioned a team of jurists to create a single, rational, and accessible code that would replace the tangled mess of local traditions. The result, enacted in 1804, was the Napoleonic Civil Code. Its principles were modern, rooted in Enlightenment ideals of equality before the law and the security of property. Yet its function was classically ancient. Napoleon himself called it his greatest victory, more lasting than any battle. The code was a deliberate weapon of national consolidation. It swept away the old provincial legal systems, imposing a uniform set of rules across the entire territory of France. This did not just simplify law, it actively constructed a new French national identity, one defined by a shared legal reality. The code became a tool of cultural and administrative imperialism as well, exported across Europe through conquest, imposing French legal standards and, by extension, solidifying French influence. The through line across 3 millennia is unmistakable. Whether the authority was a Babylonian king, a Roman emperor, or a modern state, the comprehensive written code served the same master, the centralizing power. It was always a project of standardization against local variation, of unity over diversity, of making the state the undisputed author of the rules by which society lives. The stone of Hammurabi had found its echo in the printed pages of the Civil Code, proving that the architecture of power, once discovered, is endlessly reusable. This duality lies at the very heart of the written law's legacy. For the ordinary farmer or merchant, the public stele offered a profound new form of security. Before its existence, justice was a whispered conversation between the powerful, a decision made behind closed doors that you had little hope of influencing. The code changed that dynamic. By making the rules and their penalties visible to all, it created a baseline of predictability. A commoner wronged by a local official or a wealthy landowner could now point to the king's own monument and say, "Your power has limits, and here they are written in stone." The fixed tariff for harm meant the powerful could not arbitrarily escalate punishment on a whim. In this sense, the law acted as a shield, a public check on the capricious exercise of authority by anyone, even minor elites. It promised that the state's power would be applied according to a known standard, not personal vendetta. This was a revolutionary step toward a concept we now call the rule of law, where authority itself is subject to published rules. Yet that same stone monument, in its meticulous clarity, also forged chains. By writing down the social order, the code did not just describe inequality, it legally cemented it. The different values placed on a noble's life versus a commoner's, the severe penalties for a slave who struck a citizen, these were not reflections of an informal reality, they were now the enforceable reality. The law gave the states full backing to a rigid hierarchy, making social mobility not just difficult, but a transgression against the royal order. Furthermore, while the code protected you from the arbitrary power of a local chieftain, it did so by transferring ultimate authority to a distant king and his expanding bureaucracy. Your shield against local injustice was your new chain to the central state. The law standardized your life, yes, but in doing so, it brought more of your existence under systematic surveillance and control. Your marriage, your debts, your work, even disputes with your neighbor were now matters of royal interest. The state's reach grew longer and more detailed because the law provided the map. So we are left with a foundational paradox born in ancient Mesopotamia. The written legal code was simultaneously a tool of liberation and a tool of control. It could be a shield for the vulnerable against local tyranny, and a chain that bound everyone more tightly to the throne. It promised fairness through standardization, yet delivered a fairness meticulously calibrated to uphold an unequal status quo. This is not a contradiction the ancients failed to resolve. It is the inherent tension they built into the system from the start. The law, set in stone, was designed to be both protector and prison, and our modern legal systems still carry the echo of that original, deliberate duality. Yet for all their monumental certainty, these ancient codes whisper with unanswered questions. The very stones that proclaim a finished system of justice also conceal gaps in our understanding, leaving modern scholars to debate what these laws truly meant in the daily life of the ancient world. One of the most persistent debates centers on a fundamental question: how often were these elaborate codes actually used in the courts? Were they a working legal manual, or were they primarily a magnificent piece of political theater? We have court records from places like Nippur and Ur that document real cases, and they reveal a fascinating picture. Judges in these cases do not typically quote a specific statute from Hammurabi's stele by number. Instead, they seem to operate within a broader legal culture that the code helped to shape. They reference principles of fairness, take oaths, and examine contracts and witnesses. This suggests the codes may have served more as an authoritative backdrop, a statement of royal principle that established the boundaries and spirit of the law, rather than a literal script to be read aloud in every trial. Their power was perhaps more symbolic than procedural, creating the ideal of standardized justice that influenced practice, even if the practice itself remained somewhat flexible. This symbolic function is further hinted at by the physical fate of the codes themselves. The earliest known collection, the Code of Ur-Nammu, survives only in fragments, a handful of broken tablets. We do not possess a complete, monumental version like Hammurabi's stele. This raises intriguing possibilities. Was Ur-Nammu's code ever displayed on a public monument, or was it primarily an administrative document for scribes? Its fragmentary nature leaves its public role a mystery. And if Ur-Nammu's work was this sophisticated, could there have been even earlier attempts at written legal compilation that are now lost to time entirely? The invention of writing coincided with the rise of cities and kings, making it entirely plausible that other rulers experimented with this tool of power, their steles since crumbled to dust or still buried beneath the desert. These gaps and debates remind us that history is not a solved puzzle. Each discovery, each translated tablet, adds a piece, but the full image of how justice moved from the stone into the street remains partially obscured. This evolving understanding is not a weakness in the story, but a testament to its depth, inviting us to keep questioning the very foundations of the order these kings worked so hard to set in stone. The true legacy of these ancient stones is not merely a list of rules, but a blueprint for power itself. Across the dusty plains of Sumer and Babylon, the earliest written legal codes achieved something far greater than settling disputes. They were masterful instruments of statecraft designed to solve the fundamental problem of complex society: how to govern a crowd of strangers. By standardizing justice, they did not simply make it fairer, they made it manageable, transforming chaotic local customs into a predictable royal system. This was a deliberate and systematic transfer of authority. Judicial power was pulled away from village elders, temple priests, and family patriarchs, and channeled directly toward the king's courts and his literate scribes. Every public stele was a declaration. The right to judge and punish now belongs to the crown alone. Yet this consolidation required more than force, it required a story. The codes provided that narrative brilliantly, framing the king not as a conqueror, but as a divinely chosen shepherd, the benevolent source of order and protector of the weak. His laws were presented as gifts from the gods, making obedience a sacred duty and legitimizing his rule as an essential service to cosmic harmony. This ideological foundation was then made concrete through economics. The fixed tariffs for harm monetized justice, creating a reliable stream of revenue that funded palaces, armies, and the very bureaucracy that enforced the code. Stability became a financial engine, and the king was its chief engineer. In the end, these ancient lawmakers gave us more than statutes. They established a profound and enduring principle, that law itself is the ultimate expression of sovereign authority. It is the tool through which a state defines reality, organizes society, and writes its own legitimacy into the permanent record. When you look at any modern legal system, with its uniform codes and centralized courts, you are seeing the distant echo of a Babylonian king's ambition, carved in diorite for all time. The question for us now is not whether our laws are written, but what story of power they tell, and in whose hand the chisel ultimately rests.